Hi guys, this is Eric Cressy. We're coming to you from Cressy Performance here just west of Boston, Massachusetts. This is my business partner, Tony Giannacore. He's going to help me out with some demonstrations. And we're going to kick this week off with a little bit of a look of how shoulders work. And the thing you want to appreciate about this entire week of videos that we're going to bring to you is that we're really going to try to illustrate how each body is unique. How certain people move one way, other people may move a little bit differently, and that needs to be reflected in how you assess and how you program for yourself in your strength conditioning program. So we're going to start off with a little bit of a look at the shoulders today. I think Tony's a really good example. We're actually going to look at him from the back here. What you notice is he's actually got a pretty big downslope shoulder. Okay, so he sits in what we would call a little bit of scapular or shoulder blade depression. All right, this is actually a really common thing you'll see in people who do a lot of benching, a lot of pull-ups, a lot of deadlifts, and other exercises where there are heavy weights held in their hands. And that's all part of the weight training game. But we have to appreciate that the more and more we get pulled down, the harder it is for our shoulder blades to get up. And if you really think about how shoulders work and function, the name of the game with respect to keeping your shoulder healthy is keeping the ball in the socket. So what we often see with people is that they go to overhead press or do whatever else, they don't upwardly rotate that shoulder blade enough. So basically what will happen is that somebody may go overhead and that scapula, the shoulder blade, may not rotate up enough on the rib cage in order to maintain that ball sitting on the socket. Okay, when that happens, we come up, we get some rotator cuff impingement, we can irritate our labrum, our biceps tendon. We wind up with that shoulder pain in the front or on top. So the thing that's a little bit tricky is we have to appreciate that different exercises in our program will either work to address this problem or it will feed into this dysfunction at first. So one of the things I want to show you is actually how a bench press kind of affects this. So Tony's going to set up on the bench, and one of the coaching cues that we use for folks when they're going through a bench press in many cases is lock those shoulder blades down underneath you, get them tucked down and back so that you can create a good platform from which to press. So Tony, why don't you show us your benching technique? He'll get set up. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually bring the video over to the side here, and I just want you to notice the angle of his arm relative to his body as he goes through it. So do a couple reps for us. So as he comes down, notice where he finishes up. He's probably slightly below 90 degrees of elevation with his arm. Okay, so you can go ahead and rack that. We'll stand right up. So if we look at what's actually happening with Tony, put your arm right out in front of you, just like this. Turn to the side. So if his bench press finishes here, he's never really had a chance to let that shoulder blade move up on his rib cage. Instead, he's actually cranked it further and further down and created a little bit more of that depression and downward rotation. So bench pressing is a great upper body exercise, but we need to appreciate that it needs to be complemented by other exercises that will allow that scapula to move freely. I think this is one example of why we need to really make sure we have plenty of push-up variations in our programming to go along with our benching variations. So if Tony hops down and does a regular push-up for us, what I want you to take note of is how much more his shoulder blade can move on his rib cage as he goes through this pattern, as opposed to what would actually happen with a bench press. See how these guys can move freely on the rib cage as he goes through it? Okay. We can progress that a little bit more and do what's called a yoga push-up. So if he goes into a yoga push-up, it's the exact same thing as the regular one, but as he gets to the top, he's actually going to push himself away from the ground and get more elevation of his arms, which makes those shoulder blades move a little bit more. So whether you include an exercise like this in your warm-up or in your actual training program, it's a great opportunity to teach your shoulders how to move effectively. Okay? If we want to progress it, we literally just take a step over here and throw Tony's feet up on a box. Okay? We do a feet elevated push-up. It actually changes some of the muscular recruitment on our shoulder girdle and can in fact make things work a little bit easier. So if we go up and do this push-up, notice where Tony gets to in the top position if he maintains a good neutral core position. So he's down and he's up. Notice how there's more shoulder flexion taking place. There's more movement of that scapula on the rib cage. So it's a great option for kind of progressing things. Building on that a little bit more, we're actually going to look at some overhead pressing. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, if you look at some of the best bench pressers out there are a lot of guys who have said, hey, my bench press went through the roof the second I started doing more and more overhead pressing. So obviously not everybody can do that overhead pressing because they may have a history of shoulder pain or poor movements, but I think one of the reasons that happens is we take people who have been conditioned to do all their pressing with their shoulder blades stuck down and back, and instead we have allowed that scapula to move freely, and we've kind of given them some variety in their training program to create that stimulus. So we do a kettlebell overhead press here. Tony's going to go half kneeling, and actually we're going to turn and face that way so that the camera can see what's going on with your shoulder blades. What we're going to notice is, as Tony goes into his overhead press, follow that scapula. Notice how it can move as he goes through things. Great thing about this exercise too, you get some rotary stability. So he's resisting the effect of the kettlebell to tip him to the side. As he presses overhead, he's also fighting that arch in his low back, so he's getting some good anterior core function. He's getting a little hip flexor stretch. He's getting some glute activation on that back side. We get a lot more out of that than as if he was just going onto a bench and doing a bench press with everything kind of stuck down in place. So it's all about variety. Okay? One last option that we really like to use with people is what's called a landmine press. So as we come over here, we do a half kneeling landmine press just to demonstrate it. What you'll notice is a lot of the exact same cues that we get with the overhead press, but it's maybe a little bit more shoulder friendly because we don't have to get quite so far up overhead and we're not completely working against gravity. So it's kind of like a nice blend of a horizontal press and a vertical press. So you'll notice as Tony comes into this one, he's almost leaning into the bar just a little bit as he presses it to get that shoulder blade to upwardly rotate. All right. If you felt any pinching in the front, maybe he needs to tip back a little bit more. Maybe he needs to get a little bit more elevation of his shoulder blade to get where he needs to be. Okay. And you can take these concepts and apply them to different exercises. Maybe if you're someone who's really stuck down and back with those big downslope shoulders, you do more kettlebell Turkish get-ups to kind of get an opportunity to get your arm up overhead. Maybe you do some bottoms-up carries with the kettlebell. Maybe you do some barbell overhead shrugs. Maybe you do some push presses. Something like that can really go a long way in helping to optimize that shoulder function. Because it's not just about taking care of pain once it's there. It's about good programming that keeps you from getting to a point where you do have symptoms. Beyond that, I think you're going to find that integrating a lot of these exercises give you some great exercise variations that'll keep training fun and interesting.